Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here on Tuesday night for the first in our Tom Ruth Speaker Series webcast. I'll be your host tonight, Zach Lehman, headmaster. I'm here live on our Pottstown campus, and we're glad you're here tonight. As some of you know, the Tom Ruth Speaker Series was created in honor of longtime beloved instructor of history emeritus, Tom Ruth, who taught at the Hill for 33 years and passed away in February 2016. Tonight, our first speaker for the spring series will be Dr. Thomas McCarter, class of '84 and a two-time parent, including a current sixth former. And as you, I'm sure, have read, Dr. Tom McCarter serves as the Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Versalus Health. Through his work at his own hospitals and through his business relationships with client hospitals, Dr. McCarter has had the experience of leading and supporting health systems and other organizations through numerous scenarios over the last 2 decades, from 9/11, the 2009 pandemic, and today. So I'm gonna, hopefully this will work and you can see Tom and you can see me. Wonderful. I can see you, Tom. How are you?
Good evening. Good. How are you?
I'm great. Well, we have a lot of people joining us tonight, about 50 attendees, which is wonderful for our first panel or first webcast. And I'm glad to see you again. Tom, tell us where you are right now.
We are sequestered on our family farm in Unionville, Pennsylvania, with my wife Ann, Jane, Will's here, and 2 dogs and several chickens.
Well, there is a shortage on eggs right now, so you've got
Not here.
There's a lot of stress baking going on, I hear.
Yes.
So I might have to stop by and get some eggs. My daughter's making a lot of pastries these days. Well, thanks for joining us. Tom, before we get started, you obviously knew Tom Ruth?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about your relationship with Tom Ruth, and did you ever have his class?
I never had his class, but I, as a 4th former, was in the Wendell dormitory, living on the 1st floor. Tom, I believe, was on the 3rd floor. I know he was upstairs. I think Doc Finn was on 2, and Tom was on the 3rd floor. So he was our dorm parent. And then my roommate, Mark, and I were prefects in Wendell 1 in our senior year. So we got to work with Tom again. He was always a good person to stop in and have a chat and want to share his experiences with people, and very fun to have him in the environment.
So when you came to Hill, where were you from at the time? Were you from Unionville?
No, I grew up in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. I grew up in a family of steel workers and contractors, and it's probably said that my enrollment at the Hill in 1981 was about as unlikely as it was fortuitous. When I was born, my father had been drafted into the Army, and my mother and I lived with my grandparents and their 4 other daughters. My family was poor. My grandfather's father had died when he was 10, and he went to work to support his mother and his siblings in a house that had no electricity and no running water. And he and his brothers joined the Army in World War II. They fought together, all came home, fortunately. As a child, I had a horrible speech impediment. I couldn't pronounce R's. Anytime I said the letter T, it came out as an F, and therefore I was slapped anytime I said the word truck, and I really didn't understand why. And I learned that it's not something you can yell in a parking lot for any reason.
Got it.
Despite having good grades, I was declared learning disabled by the time I was in the 5th grade. One of my teachers intervened and changed my life and kind of led to the direction toward the Hill. But no one in my family had ever attended boarding school or college. The idea of attending a boarding school was a bit daunting, but obviously one of the best decisions that I'd ever made.
And you arrived as a 3rd former?
4th former, yeah. I was there 4th former through my graduation in 1984.
So all boys at the time, a little bit different?
Yes, yes.
And when you graduated, where did you head after Hill?
During my senior year, my roommate and I were both offered Moorhead scholarships to attend the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So we accepted, and I attended UNC and majored in biology and chemistry.
Does this happen to be your, hold on, I'm going to try to do this the right way here. I'm going to try to share my screen. I think I can get a picture of your roommate.
Oh, great.
Yeah, hold on. This will be fun. Let's see here. How's that look? Is that your roommate?
Yeah, on the right, that's Mark Rogers and me on the right side of the right photo. It's me on the left with the University of North Carolina sweatshirt. That's probably when we got the notice that we were both accepted. We didn't think it could happen. We thought maybe one of us, but we actually weren't talking to each other because we were afraid the other one might have gotten it or not gotten it. And then we realized our parents had a phone call and realized we'd both been offered scholarships. So it was quite a day.
You look very pensive in that picture.
I think I may be playing the piano in that picture, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm looking down at a keyboard, as opposed to being hot lit today by a computer screen.
Yeah. Well, I've got a couple other pictures here from your Hill days. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, I was probably one of the more physical lacrosse goalies. I might not have been that good, so if anybody was close enough, I preferred to just hit them rather than have them throw a ball at me at 100 miles an hour. So.
I know someone who's a lot like that. I don't know if you heard my chapel talk, but it was all about playing lacrosse goalie once upon a time too. So we've got that in common. And then, of course, here's the handsome Tom McCarter.
Yeah, we should just leave that up for the rest of the conference here, Zach. Let's have that as the backdrop, maybe.
That was your sixth form picture. And in addition to being an alumnus of the school, my recollection is you have two children that went to Hill here, right? Jane's probably on the line listening.
Yeah, Will graduated in 2017. He's at Penn State. Well, he's enrolled at Penn State and currently taking his classes from our dining room. And Jane is just finishing up spring break and has been with us sequestered here since the 6th. And she's a senior this year at the Hill.
Right. And started Virtual Hill yesterday.
Yes.
Well, great. Well, terrific. And tell me, I know we talked a little bit about your time at Hill, but what's probably your favorite memory from your years at Hill, your 3 years at Hill?
Well, I mean, if you ask me my fondest memory of the Hill, since my wife's probably listening with the kids, I'd have to say that I don't want to sleep in the barn for the rest of the pandemic. So my most memorable Hill memory is a bit unique. I was actually married in the Hill School Chapel in 1992 when Ann and I graduated from medical school. And Father Regal did the ceremony. He never told us in advance, but the ceremony was on the day of his wedding anniversary as well. So we shared that date moving forward. We had the reception in the dining hall, and Harry Price and Karen and Rick Walbridge, who we sorely miss, and a lot of our friends from Hill were there, as well as our friends and family. So that has to be my favorite memory. That being said, you showed the kids having two children go through the Hill and having their memories, watching them as Will on the Dell Field and the stage, and Jane playing ice hockey in a Hill jersey and speaking in that chapel that means so much to us. I have to say these have to be my new fondest Hill memories.
Well, please give my best to your kids. Obviously know them both, and Will is a close friend of my son Griffin, and I'm sure Griffin is in quarantine too, so he knows he knows what it's like. In any event, so you went to UNC. After UNC, obviously went to medical school. You mentioned that. Tell us a little bit of how your profession came about.
So after medical school, I did my residency in internal medicine started at the Hospital, University of Pennsylvania. Ann and I then moved out to Geisinger Medical Center in Danville, Pennsylvania. Finished my residency and spent a couple years as chief medical resident there and teaching on the teaching faculty while Ann completed her training. We then came back to Philadelphia, where we wanted to kind of settle down. I joined the faculty at Hahnemann and Medical College of Pennsylvania, and joined the faculty at Thomas Jefferson University. I was a practicing hospitalist, so I did a lot of my business in the hospital, and I had outpatient practices, and while I was treating my patients, I was teaching medical students and residents. And that's how we kind of started our practice.
So for how many
years? Go ahead.
How many years were you practicing doctor in the hospitals?
For about 7 years at that point in time. And then I moved into hospital administration. So I started actually managing hospitals. I kept my practice up initially, mostly because I enjoyed the teaching. But I kept seeing patients for the first couple of years. I was the vice president of medical affairs for 8 hospitals and 2 medical schools that made up the Pennsylvania region of Tenet Healthcare. And then I moved out to Mainline Health and was the chief medical officer of their system after that. After about 2003, 2007 maybe, I moved into the private sector, spent a lot of time consulting, and then one of the companies that I was consulting for asked me to come on board, and we worked with hospitals across the country. We actually grew to the point that half of the hospitals in the United States were using our services. We sold that company, and then since then I've started two other companies that I'm currently working for. One, Team of Care Solutions, and the other is Versalus Health, and I'm the chief medical officer for both of those hospitals, working with hospitals across the United States.
Well, you've just described your career in like 4 minutes, Tom. But we have a lot of students listening tonight and young alums, I'm sure, who are maybe interested in a medical career. You know, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being like the hardest thing you've ever had to do, and 1 being, you know, waking up for breakfast, how hard of a career is that? Like, how hard is it to get to where you got?
Well, as I tell people, and I get that question pretty often, there aren't many careers where you're going to spend 4 years in college, 4 years in medical school. In my case, 3 years of residency, 1 year of chief residency. In Ann's case, 5 years of residency, 1 year of fellowship before you're actually completed with your training and can actually start a job. So my recommendation to folks is, if you ever thought about something else, you might want to give it a try. A lot of people are going to medical school later in life, and getting some experience with other things is actually, I think, helpful. But if you can't imagine anything else, then that's what you've got to do. Obviously, in days like today, it's very difficult to be a physician, and there are obviously a lot of stressors that even come with it downstream, but just getting to that first part, it's a long haul.
Yeah. Well, I think, I don't have any statistics in front of me, but, you know, when you were graduating from college, when I was graduating from college, the medical profession was still one of the most sort of honorable, attractive, profitable areas to go into. And now my sense is that there's less students that are pursuing that. Maybe you probably know that a lot better than I do.
Yeah, I think, you know, when you look at the world of 20 years ago versus today, certainly I believe the rewards, both financial and just being more appreciated, more viewed as a professional, were probably a bit bigger then. That being said, there aren't many jobs that you can actually go to work and dramatically change somebody's life in several times a day. I mean, when I think about my time as a resident at Penn, I mean, the people around you are just heroic, and the interactions that you're doing every day are phenomenal. And there aren't many jobs that have those types of reward, but at the same time, it's tiring. It takes a lot out of you. I mean, look at my picture versus high school. I probably aged 30 years in that residency and training program. So,
I think you look good, Tom. Well, I think never has that statement been more true in terms of the impact that healthcare professionals and doctors can have. We're seeing that right now, and you know, you see a lot of words like heroes being thrown around about our healthcare professionals right now, and so thank you for what you've done all these years, and let's talk about what you're doing today. You know, one of the reasons I've asked you to be our first speaker at this interesting time in history is that about 2 months ago, we sat down for the first time to talk about planning for a pandemic and planning for the Hill School for a pandemic. And I didn't know this. I'd seen you at a lot of hockey games and lacrosse games and various Hill events, but I didn't know the full extent of your background in terms of your advisory role to different organizations and hospitals and schools even with respect to planning for this. I'm not sure we knew about this type of crises, but other similar crises and pandemics. And so talk a little bit about how one trains for that, how you've become an expert in that, and you know, a little bit of what you've done in terms of your history of being someone who's an expert in pandemic planning.
Well, I can't say that I had any real, you know, formal training education in it. You can. a lot of people go off and do programs called Masters in Public Health and become epidemiologists and go to work for the CDC. For me, it was really that I at a very young age was asked to take over a health system that had some significant problems, and found myself as an administrator over 8 hospitals and 2 medical schools. And during that period of time, 9/11 happened. And hospitals have always prepared. We've prepared for big car accidents, chemical spills. That's part of being a hospital. You have an emergency plan. We have a response called an all-hazard response that begins the action, and then you customize your response to the specifics of the event. But after 9/11, things obviously changed. I remember I was on vacation that day, and when the first plane hit the World Trade Center, I was sitting with Ann watching Good Morning America. My parents had Will at a park across the street. And as soon as the plane hit the building, I just looked at Ann and I said, "That's an attack. Planes don't hit buildings." And I went outside and got Will and got my parents and gassed up the cars and sent people to get money from a Mac machine as I was setting up my laptop in my remote office, and we had all of my staff evacuated by noon that day. You have to be aware of what triggers are, and there are bad things that happen. And that experience, I started working with about 15 health systems in Philadelphia that year under a Department of Defense grant, and one of the gentlemen I started one of these companies with, Team of Care Solutions, my partner in that, Mark Stabile, is a West Point graduate, Army Ranger, Masters in Public Health at Columbia, and he ran the process of us working with 15 different health systems in Philadelphia to prepare for different events. Not as one individual hospital, but how does an entire city work together to prepare for an event like the one we're seeing today? So unfortunately, through the years, I've had the experience of planning events that have happened and haven't happened, and preparing for them and modeling them out, hoping that I'd never use those skill sets. And as you said, you didn't know, because I don't talk about it with my family. I don't talk about it with many people. It's a
Until
unique
tonight,
skill
you're
set.
talking about it with
Yeah. It's not cocktail party discussion, what would you do if there was an anthrax drop, But unfortunately, I found myself in a situation where I felt that it was necessary to have that experience.
Well, I can say firsthand, spending a few hours with you, that first conversation and then subsequent conversations have been really helpful in terms of our planning. Certainly, I've described it as sort of like we're building the plane as we're flying it, but it's been helpful to have you guiding us as we, you were very helpful in terms of giving us ideas about what might happen, what our responses might be, and just get us thinking in the proper way. So thank you. I'm glad I did find out.
It was a pleasure.
Well, so tell me, before we get to some of your thoughts on the current situation, how is it impacting your business? And, I think we know how it's impacting your home life and family life, like most of us. But how is it as a business administrator, how are you managing that?
Well, fortunately, both of my companies are in total remote capacity today. We've built our operations. The nice thing about starting some new companies is you can take the experience you've had, and we built out our operations to enable a fully remote conversion at any time. So we were very fortunate. We converted our operations to completely remote about 3 weeks ago, about a week before the governor did the county by county limitation on travel. So we were in a good situation to be able to do that. We have done a deep clean of our office to make sure that it's safe when we do have to return. In the meantime, all of our folks are remote. We have a daily call with our executive team to essentially compare what we've seen. Our employees are on the phone all day and computer connected to hospitals looking at data across the United States. So we've been in a situation where we could easily make that move as a company.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Tom, what was what for you was the trigger? When did you know that this was going to be as bad as it has become? or was it just a gradual progression? You know, what were the red flags? What were those milestones where you said, okay, time to switch to virtual, time to start preparing organizations that we're working with for this?
Well, when I saw the cases growing in China in January, I remember I had a case. I had to fly out to San Francisco and spend a week in San Francisco at about January 27th. I mean, obviously, we were aware that something was going on in the world. Obviously, we knew that China was the first place that we were seeing these cases, and I was flying into San Francisco, which was one of 6 hospitals in the world that had direct flights to Wuhan. So I had an N95 respirator in my bag in last week of January 27th. Never deployed it, never used it. But at that point, it was possible that we would start seeing cases, and we'd start seeing cases around those points of entry. I thought maybe, it wouldn't, you can never predict, well, how bad is it going to be, because, hopefully we're taking the right steps to prevent the growth and the spread of the virus. Once I saw that there were cases as we talked about, their first case in the United States, first human transmission in the United States, first case in the state, that's when I started saying, okay, wait a minute. I've got people on airplanes every day flying all over the country for business. So we made the decision to curtail all travel, and then quickly thereafter we said, it's not a disadvantage for us to go remote. Let's just do it now. Let's separate. Initially, we had some people that needed to be in the office for a while, and so to make them safe, we took everyone else out of the office to allow the people that really needed to be there to not have a lot of traffic in and out.
So like most of us, it seems like you took sort of a step-by-step, keep your options open, but gradually get to a place where you're remote and sort of shut down from a physical standpoint. I think that's the approach we certainly took at Hill. We most of our public officials are taking, step by step. You mentioned Governor Wolf, a Hill class of 1967, who's taken the state sort of county by county.
Yes.
Do you think in retrospect, I mean, it's easy to sort of play Monday morning quarterback here, but in retrospect, should we have been more drastic in our steps? And people are talking about sort of this lost month where we could have been doing a lot more as a country to prepare for this. Or do you think that in general, it was appropriate to take those sort of step-by-step measures?
Well, you can never predict what's going to happen in these situations. And even when your team and I first spoke, it wasn't a tactical discussion. It's a discussion about strategies. What might be the things that we see over the next 3 to 6 months, and what strategies might we choose to deploy, and how might those strategies be either successful or vulnerable? And I think that's what we've had to do as a country. When it seemed like the cases were off the borders, I think it was very appropriate and very timely. In fact, when I think back over pandemics that I've managed, 2014 Ebola, 2009 influenza pandemic, the 2009 pandemic, if I were to ask how many people know that we had a pandemic in 2009, I'd be willing to bet not many people realize that there was a pretty major pandemic.
Well, I mentioned that at the top of the show here, and as I was saying, the 2009 pandemic, I'm sure there's a lot of people going, what is he talking about? What 2009?
Yeah. Well, in 2009, we had a pandemic.
What happened in 2009?
Yeah. We had a pandemic in 2009 with influenza. Yeah. 61 million Americans got infected that year with a new strain of influenza. And so, again, but we didn't shut down travel. We didn't close down. There were some schools that closed down in hotspot areas, but we didn't close down schools. We didn't stop people from going to work. And so I think that what I can say about the current situation is, and again, not just for the United States, but worldwide, I have never seen a reaction to any biological event, pandemic event, that goes anywhere near what we're seeing in the world today. And that's probably good news. People are taking this very seriously. People are taking it seriously from a government standpoint, from a private sector standpoint. People are taking it seriously from a personal standpoint. They're staying home. They're trying not to interact with others. And I think that that actually it gives me hope that maybe we're gonna limit the damage and slow the course here.
So what do you attribute that to? You mentioned the 2009 pandemic, Tom. What you said, 61 million Americans infected. You didn't mention the number of deaths. You know, pretty contagious, fairly lethal. What is it about this pandemic and COVID-19 and coronavirus that you think has triggered that global movement to shut it down?
Well, there are two things I think about in terms of bacterial agents or viral agents and their ability to cause a problem from a pandemic standpoint or an epidemic standpoint. We talk about the degree of contagiousness. How quickly does the organism spread from one person to another? And there's a number for that folks at the CDC and epidemiologists use. It's called the R0. The R0 is a measure of if one person gets this virus, how many people do they transmit it to or spread it to on average? And for influenza, the R0 for influenza is about 1.3. For COVID-19, it's about 2 to 3 times that number. So this is an organism, this virus, SARS coronavirus 19, this virus spreads 3 times faster than influenza. And that's one of the reasons that I think people, when you see the fast movement that we see with this organism, more people take it seriously. The second issue then becomes, okay, coronavirus, this is a coronavirus. There's another coronavirus, and it causes the common cold. In fact, 4 of the 7 known coronaviruses that we know of cause common colds. We all get a common cold, but none of us are going to get sick to the degree that we need an intensive care unit and the mortality associated with low. So the other measure we look at in an environment like this is the mortality that is associated with the disease. And for COVID-19, the mortality based on what we were seeing early in China was estimated to be 2% to 3%. The mortality associated with influenza is about 0.1%. So we're talking about an organism that has a 20-fold higher likelihood of causing mortality. When you get something that has the ability to move faster and kill more people, obviously we want to put every resource into that. And that's why we need to do the things that we know have worked in pandemics in the past. The most important event is shut down schools. And I was very pleased to see Governor Wolf do that. When we were talking, I kind of mentioned one of the frustrating things for me is saying, this is the most important thing we have to do. And again, more at the public level, I know you were on spring break while we were, making this decision, but I heard these debates that, well, if we close down the schools, the students won't have safe places to go. And if we close down the schools, that's all very important. But nothing is more important than stopping the spread of the virus, and the most important thing that we can do is prevent that degree of close proximity, spread. So shutting down the schools, shutting down travel, shutting down businesses, telling people to work remotely, telling people to maintain social distance, and just keep yourself from getting infected. We spent a lot of time, especially over the weekend. I was on the phone with doctors from across the country and some people who I'm sure you've all heard about and seen that are working so hard at this. Steve Hahn, the commissioner of the FDA, Seema Verna, the director of Medicare and Medicaid at Department of Health and Human Services, Dr. Dorothy Birx, who's on the president's task force. I mean, these people all day, every day. We had a 2-hour conference call with doctors from Washington State talking about how they're managing ventilators, New York about how we're doing very quickly research to see what agents work and what things work. Doctors from Emory talking about their early experience. And, these are the hospitals that treated Ebola patients. These are the hospitals that have the experience in a pandemic who are managing these cases. It's a lot of information that's coming in fast and furious, but for people who, that medicine is great to understand and talk about, but that doesn't stop the virus. That stops the people who get sick from the virus, hopefully from dying. But the only way we stop the virus is staying apart, washing our hands, and not getting infected.
Tom, you've mentioned a lot of the things that we know that the general public has come to learn about COVID-19, the mortality rate, the rate of spread. What are the general measures that can prevent that spread? Social distancing. We're calling it physical distancing here at the Hill. We want to stay social. In terms of all of the hygienic, the therapeutic medicines, the potential for a vaccine. What is one thing that the general public does not know, in your opinion, or has not fully yet come to realize about COVID-19 that concerns you the most?
Well, I was surprised. I got a call today to answer some questions for someone, and I think there seems to be confusion about how the virus spreads. I know we talk about don't touch your hands, don't wash your hands, but I mean, I'm not sure that everybody really understands why and what we're talking about there. Viruses like COVID-19 primarily spread by what are called respiratory droplets, small droplets of moisture that come out of our mouths when we breathe, when we speak. And those respiratory droplets, if I'm within 3 feet of someone, I can actually spread a virus from me to them just through those respiratory droplets. That's the importance of the social distancing, of staying apart. Those droplets transmit the virus from person to person directly if they can. If we cough or we sneeze and it's not covered, those droplets can go even further. But if those droplets settle on a surface, we know that for this virus, droplets can live on viral particles can live on that surface for hours. And so that's why it's so important to wash your hands. It's possible that a virus landed on a surface, we now contaminate our hands by touching that surface, and if we touch our mouth or our eyes, then we could actually infect ourselves through our hands that way. So I think just reminding ourselves of the virus spreads through humans. This virus is an RNA virus. It can't even reproduce on its own. It needs your cells to reproduce, and it needs your body to carry it to its next victim or its next host, depending on how you look at the world. If we can just stop that transmission, that's what stops the virus. The healthcare then will deal with the people that get infected as best we can, but we need to stop the virus by doing these things that might not seem like they're very complicated, but these are the things that matter, and these are the things that history have taught us.
Can I ask you probably a really dumb question? But I was having this conversation at home the other day. I have a lot of dumb questions, but they talk about the different kinds of cleaning agents that will clean the virus. Lysol, Clorox. The ones that are FDA approved to kill the virus. So everyone's wiping down with Lysol wipes, Clorox wipes, that sort of thing. Why is it that regular soap can clean can kill the virus on your hands, but can't, just soap and water can't kill it on a surface?
Well, soap and water, it's not that soap and water can't necessarily kill it on a surface. The action of washing your hands, of the water flowing over the hands and the soap dissolving anything that's on your or on your hands that could be a contaminant or soil, will just carry the virus away. I mean, the virus also, if you put normal cells in water that has zero salt content, those cells explode. Just water itself is in chemistry, and again, I'm a long way away from it, so maybe one of our listeners can correct my statement. But we refer to water, I think, as a universal solvent. It works pretty well. So soap and water for the proper amount of time with the mechanical process of rubbing actually removes the virus fairly effectively from your hands. And likewise, a mechanical process of rubbing a surface will remove virus as well. By using a product like a Lysol or a Clorox, what you're doing is also leaving some residual behind. A friend of mine has a company, a nano company in the South that has this thing. I was going to use it for the hockey equipment because that's just god-awful, as you know. But it sprays out this nanoparticle that lands, and then when that nanoparticle gets exposed to sunlight, it oxidizes everything in the environment. So it leaves actually a killing film on the surface of everything around it. So that's kind of what you're doing with the Lysol and the Clorox. It's not just cleaning now, but you're also leaving something that might kill some viral particles for a while after you walk away as well. And again, great. If you want to learn, go to the CDC's website. It's publicly available. cdc.gov. It's not hard. Charlie, Delta, Charlie, .golf. Golf, what's the O? Oscar, Victor. You know, they have all kinds of information. They have how to make your own Clorox solution and how to do things at home. And the nice thing about it is it's vetted information. It's good information. Be very careful. One of my concerns of what I see right now is a lot of information on social media and a lot of information even in the media that's just not factually correct and actually in some situations could be dangerous. So get your information from good sources, get your information from vetted sources, and cdc.gov is a place I'm probably on the website 10 times a day.
Well, I want to give time to our listeners to ask a bunch of questions. I just have one more, and then we'll turn it over. You mentioned that, you know, the droplets are the respiratory droplets are what's mostly spreading it here.
Yes.
And you mentioned that, you know, by standing at a distance from people, you can avoid that, but sometimes they can go further. I read about this terrible case of the choir at a church where they had a singing practice, and something like 80% of the people that were there, you know, because they were projecting their voices. You know, we're hearing 6 feet. There was an article today, 27 feet. And you said social media, it's hard to know what to believe, but what's your opinion on this? Like, how far apart should we be? What should our physical distancing be? And I know the next question, probably from one of our listeners, is when's that going to end? But let's start with what the right distance is in your opinion. I don't even know where 6 feet came from.
Minimum distance for normal conversations should be somewhere between 3 to 6 feet. But again, as far apart as you can reasonably. Again, my mom is in her 70s. We've been fairly locked down here, but you know, we're still going to the grocery store. I've had to go into the office for a couple of times. It's possible on any of those exposures that something could happen. So, you know, we wanted to visit my mom, you know, over the weekend, but we also didn't want to put her, especially because she's an older patient. She's higher risk. So we actually called her and said, we're coming over. We drove over. We stood outside in her backyard and you know, kind of just sat around, stood around outside 6 feet apart and caught up for about an hour. I would try to stay 3 to 6 feet apart. Again, if you can't, you know, or if you can, the further is better. I think the issue that we saw in the Washington example that you gave is, as you said, these people, 60 people went to a choral rehearsal. They were projecting their voices. I saw one image of a gentleman standing behind someone playing the piano. You know, they weren't necessarily 3 to 6 feet apart, but if you're projecting your voice, that might not be far enough apart. And 45 people are positive, and I believe 2 of the 60 have died. So that type of a situation in today's world, we just need to not have that. We don't want to have that event. We need to be meeting as we are this evening.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give our listeners some advice on how to ask a question. There's 2 ways. The first is you can write your question by using the Q&A box that's at the bottom middle of your screen. If you roll over it, it'll show up, and you can write that question in. We will answer those questions, as many as we can, or I'll ask Tom to answer them. And please direct your questions to Tom. He's the one with the actual expert opinion here. And I'll read those off to him. I won't say your name unless you tell me you want me to say your name. The other way you can do it is by raising your hand. So by now, most of our listeners have used Zoom a few times. In the participant panel, you can just raise your hand, and then I will actually unmute you so that you can talk to our listeners. so you can talk, so our listeners can hear you and Tom can hear you. So that's sort of the fun part of this tonight. You never know what you're going to get with that. So while we're waiting, so please go ahead and start populating those questions and raise your hand. While we're waiting for that, Tom, I have one more question. So please go ahead and ask your questions online. Tom, mask or no mask? That's a big question that's coming our way, starting to come up in terms of should we, even if we're feeling healthy and asymptomatic, when we're going out into public, when we're going grocery shopping, when we're walking down the street, should we be wearing masks?
And again, I told you when I was flying to San Francisco back in January, I have my N95 with me, and I never deployed it, never took it out of my bag. Current recommendations from our CDC and historically has been that the masks aren't necessary if you can preserve that social distance that we've been talking about. Now, obviously, if I am in a facility where my job is to screen people who are presenting because they're symptomatic and concerned about having coronavirus, and I'm in the process of actively testing them, all of those high-risk individuals should be in a mask and what we call personal protective equipment. I think everybody knows what PPE is now. That's something else we've learned from the pandemic. Not only a mask, but a mask, eye cover, just like a chainsaw. Eye cover, mask, gloves, and something waterproof over your body.
Yeah, I'm not sure we should be comparing it to a chainsaw, Tom. But
well, that's around here when we put on the eyes and the ears. It's usually a chainsaw that's coming out. Sure. But so the mask question comes up in a situation. I know that in New York City is going through a surge right now. And when you look at all the testing around the country, I just looked at the Pennsylvania numbers today. I looked at the Chester County, Delco, Montgomery County numbers today. Of all the people that are being tested in all of those areas. So why are we testing? Somebody should have fever. They should have symptoms. There's a reason we're doing the test. We should not be just testing someone who's asymptomatic. In those situations where we have a selected group that we're testing, of those that are positive versus negative, 90% of the tests we're doing in most of the United States are negative. 90% of the people who are being tested are still negative. Only 10% are positive, 11, 12, okay, in that range. So we use that to say, or when I look at those numbers, I say, even in a selected group of the population who's presenting with fever and symptoms to a point where they're being tested, even in that selected group, the prevalence of the virus is only 10%. When you do that same math in New York City right now, when we look at all the people presenting for testing in New York City, that number is closer to 28%. So the virus is at a higher level in that environment. In that environment, we always have our paramedics who are going out as first responders. They have masks, they have gloves, they have eye protection. Our police have masks and gloves. This isn't the first infectious event that we've gone through. I think in those environments where you could be required to very closely interface with someone, it would be appropriate for those individuals to be using appropriate protective equipment. I do not wear a mask when I go out to the grocery store at this point in time in the state that I'm in. If those numbers in New York keep climbing, that more and more of the population have it, and you can't social distance, a lot easier for me to social distance out here on my farm. Okay? If you can't social distance, then there might be a need for a mask. When you wear a surgical mask, it's because you have symptoms and you're preventing something from spreading to someone else. If you want to prevent yourself, a surgical mask or an N95 can do that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, while we were talking, we got a ton of questions, including that exact question. So we answered that question. There's a handful here from students, which are basically the same question, which is sort of the punchline here. But when do you think the peak will happen? And we can talk about it, Pennsylvania or U.S., however you want to talk about that. When will it end? And when will these sort of protocols for staying at home and physical distancing end, or change?
When will the peak happen? All I can tell you about when the peak will happen is it will not be at one time for the United States. I mean, just look at what we've seen already from this, and this is common to all other pandemics that I've studied or that I've been a part of. This event started with cases being described in China. We then watched certain hotspots in Europe, Italy probably being the hardest hit hotspot, Spain being not close, not a far second. And then we started seeing the United States being impacted, but we're now seeing hotspots in the United States. So I can't predict when. I will tell you New York right now is experiencing the surge. The surge is when...
Even though Cuomo is saying the surge is 2 weeks away.
Now, the surge is now, it's starting. It started probably a week ago, Saturday night. I don't think they've seen all of the surge, but the initiation of that surge is happening in New York. I mean, when I look at my daily numbers, and I apologize, I'm going to try to just pull up my daily numbers here for a second so I'm not looking at the video feed. But New York on March the 22nd, so I don't know, someone with an MBA tell me that was, what, 9 days ago?
I've lost track of all time. COVID days are like 19 days in a regular year.
Yeah, on March 22nd, New York State was reporting 6,834 cases. They went up to 15,000, 21,000, 26,000, 32,000. So we're seeing 30% growth rate per day in positive cases in New York. On the 27th and the 28th, peaking out at 63%. And now I'm starting to see those numbers start to go down to 20% again. But that initial, we talk about 6 phases of a pandemic. What we're seeing is moving from the first stage, which is we see some cases that may be intriguing, to initiation when we start seeing human-to-human transmission. And now we're in this acceleration phase where you see that number start to take off. New York is going through that acceleration phase right now. Looking across the country, LA, Los Angeles is probably not far. Washington State is not far. Washington State's saying they're looking out 3 to 4 weeks. New Orleans is starting to get a little hot. Chicago is getting a little hot. So now again, if social distancing does its job, we may not see some of those hot spots bloom. Right. But we just have to look at the cases that we have now. So I can't predict the timing. When will it all happen? When will it all stop? This is kind of the big question. And I haven't given up all hope. When we talk about influenza, and this isn't influenza, but when we talk about influenza, influenza moves around the world in a cyclical pattern, and it strikes the United States between the months of October and March. Each year we develop a flu vaccine that I hope everyone will now get on an annual basis with religiosity and great religiosity. If we have a vaccine that can prevent something like this, why would we not take it? Influenza kills 50,000 Americans every year. That's many more that have been impacted by this pandemic so far today. So influenza starts in October and it ends in March, and we don't know why. It stops as quickly as it starts. Even influenza pandemics tend to tone down in March or April. I remember the 2009 pandemic because it started on my birthday and it ended on my birthday. And the CDC just published a report in 2017 on my birthday celebrating or doing the 7-year look back at it. So it's possible that changing weather patterns could put a little bit of a limit to how fast this virus is moving. I don't want to count on that, but it's possible. But what's really going to determine the stop is how well we adhere to the rules of social distancing. Now, what's frustrating for me is when I turn on the news and I see people playing basketball at a park, clearly not staying apart. Or I saw some images from a Florida beach yesterday where clearly people were not 6 feet apart. This is bad. And as long as we keep having those experiences, we're going to determine that this continues and it gets harder and harder to stop.
Well, that brings up a question from one of our alums, Justin Newton, who's also what we call a Ruthian. Justin asks, thank you for being here tonight. Much appreciated. For those of us who are having trouble convincing a loved one on the importance of social distancing, or perhaps quarantining. What advice would you give us in technique to help better explain why this is important and different than other things that have come before?
I think understanding how the virus moves and understanding that the virus cannot move on its own. The virus can't even reproduce on its own. This virus doesn't even have DNA. It's an RNA virus. It needs your cells to reproduce. It can't even make a copy of itself without infecting your cells. It cannot move from one person to another unless you project it or transmit it to those people. The virus stopping or the acceleration phase stopping is totally going to be dependent on us keeping our distance, staying home, and doing these things. If we don't, the virus will continue to move. And again, Tom Ruth was a history teacher. Most of what I know about pandemics I've learned from studying past history. There was, and I think my daughter might have written a history paper on this, but there was a very interesting epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793. It wasn't corona, it wasn't an influenza, but it was yellow fever. And in 1793, Philadelphia was the capital of our country. Our president was here. Our Congress was meeting in Philadelphia. And the epidemic of 1793 shut down our government. The president had to leave. The Congress had to leave. The city shut down. 1/3 of Philadelphia was killed by yellow fever that year. That is what we're trying to prevent. We tried to prevent the spread. The virus will either be stopped because we stop spreading it, or the virus will move until most of us have been exposed and therefore hopefully immune to it, one way or the other.
Tom, you mentioned that you have older parents, and I know you have sort of teenage-ish age children, right? College and high school age children. I think our generation is finding this challenge of telling our parents to stay, like, Mom, Dad, stay home. My parents are ensconced on the 23rd floor of their apartment building in New York City in Brooklyn, and telling our college-age kids or high school-age kids also to stay home, and they want to go out and do everything they normally do. How are you dealing with that as a professional who's also just a father and a son?
Yeah, it was actually surprising to me. And I think when we first talked, I talked about this a little bit, because when Anthony Fauci first used the term social distancing, it was about 3 to 4 weeks ago on one of the presidential task forces. And when he used that term, I just didn't realize that most people probably don't know what that meant. And I think, again, this is the Tom Ruth speaker series. And I had the pleasure of knowing Tom Ruth, or Truth, as he often referred to himself. Tom Ruth had a limp, and a very dignified limp. But Tom Ruth had that limp because of childhood polio. And I think one of the things that we have a problem with in the United States is we've forgotten this. In the 1940s and the 1950s, polio was a very common event. In 1952, there were about 21,000 cases that one year of people who became paralyzed due to polio. And it was an everyday knowledge of everyone in the United States that the kids would go home from school for summer. Polio is a virus that's transmitted in the summertime. They'd go to the swimming holes. They'd be playing together. They'd be going to the real movie theaters, not Netflix. And all of a sudden, somebody gets sick, and the whole community shut down. And it wasn't like someone needed to tell them to do that. It was part of our day-to-day routine. We knew how to do that. Fortunately, we got a vaccine for polio in the late 1950s, and we have not had a wild virus case of polio in the United States since 1979. And I think that's good that we could eliminate that disease from the United States, and hopefully in our lifetime, we're going to eliminate it from the planet. But we've forgotten the skills that allowed us to survive while that virus was still circulating. I think just reinforcing with people, the medicine doesn't matter, the testing doesn't matter, the drugs don't matter. The only thing that's going to stop it is us separating and playing by the rules.
So one of our students asked, is it possible that there could be a vaccine for coronavirus? And so that from, polio to, you've talked about the influenza vaccine. We're all reading about accelerated trials and, do you think that's legitimately something that's going to make a difference here?
Absolutely. And, one of the things that I've said a couple times is that the reaction to this organism and this pandemic we're experiencing, you hear the word a lot now, and it's unprecedented. We've never seen, as a world, as a globe, we've never seen this degree of resources. Scientists, economists, people trying to support the economy so people will stay home. We've never seen this type of a reaction. The virus was first being described in December. We had mapped out the entire RNA structure of this virus by January. It took us a decade to do that 20 years ago, and it was done within weeks. Now, the problem is now we have to take that structure of that virus, and we have to find protein targets that we can develop things that would trigger your immune reaction to that. Now, we know from AIDS, which is another virus that's been around, HIV for another pandemic, or so to speak, that I was actively involved managing in the first cases in Philadelphia. We know that we've never been able to come up with a vaccine that works against that virus. But for many other viruses, from dengue fever, yellow fever, there are a couple, even from Ebola from 2014, that some vaccines that have been created. So it's very possible, it's very likely, if we can find the right targets, that a vaccine will come. Problem is, it's going to take probably 6 months to get through even the basic human testing to see if it's safe and effective, and then to see if it actually works. So I can't use that as a hope to stop this pandemic, but it will prevent a future wave if we see something that starts coming back.
Tom, a number of our students here are obviously, they're all home from near to far, and they're starting to ask questions, and parents, and a few of them are here on the question board I have. Is it reasonable to think that we're going to be able to open schools in general and boarding schools in the fall? And one, and as it relates to your comments about a vaccine, I've also been reading a lot about some testing out in Colorado to identify the antibodies, so that you can, as people develop immunity to this, either temporary or long-term immunity, is that going to be the solution for how we get basically back to whatever the new normal is? Is it going to be a vaccine? Is it going to be therapeutic? Is it going to be antibody? Or is it going to be a continuation of these sort of physical distancing and protocols? Or is it going to be some combination thereof? It's sort of the silver bullet question.
Scribbling some notes, because I heard a couple things there. So yes, people are working on a vaccine as we speak, and that will be available as quickly as it can be. Go into testing. We'd probably see it for, like I said, not before. I'd be very surprised if there was anything being human subjects tested in faster than 3 to 6 months. But I think that might be something that would be available in that fall window. I want to come back to fall schools and such, but let's talk about the agents. There are a couple of things that people are talking about. One is vaccines, which we've kind of covered. Yeah. The second, you mentioned antibodies. There's something called convalescent serum, and this is old magic. This is some very old magic. When I was a resident at Penn in 1992, I made the mistake of complaining to the chairman of medicine one night. I was post-call. I hadn't left the hospital in 36 hours, and he had this rule that when we had somebody with pneumonia, we had to actually get some of their sputum and put it on a slide and look at it under a microscope and gram stain it. And, at 2 o'clock in the morning, I wanted to get at least a nap in. So I said, yeah, I have. And he insisted that the next morning that we have those slides in our pocket so he could look at them if he chose to. And he asked me for my slides. I showed it to him. I must have said something under my breath that I probably should have filtered. And he reminded me that when he was practicing, when he was doing his residency, they didn't have antibiotics. And that wasn't that long ago. So how would you treat pneumonia, even not from a virus like today, but a bacteria before we had antibiotics? And in those days, what they used to do is they used to use something called convalescent serum. They would collect the blood from volunteers, and they would look for antibodies, your immune system's reaction to the bacteria, your immune system's tools that it uses to attack that bacteria. And he would have to actually, in the middle of the night, look at that slide and not only see what type of bacteria it was like I did, but he had to type it to a specific serum type so that he could determine what to treat his patients with. And so it was a valuable learning experience for me to get yelled at.
Let me interrupt. I don't know if you've seen the article floating around. It's first was in the Wall Street Journal, but was about a Hill School doctor that
Yes.
I think did exactly that to stop an outbreak of measles in the early 1900s at Hill.
Yeah. Measles.
The same old magic?
Old magic, yeah. And again, this is the same old magic that we use. We use horse serum to treat snakebite victims because the horses will make an antibody that will neutralize the toxin from the snake bites. So, there is this thing called convalescent serum. For people who have the virus and recover from the virus, their immune system makes proteins that will attack that virus. We can then take those proteins and give them to other people and hopefully prevent or treat them when they're very sick.
But can't you also, even before you help others, can't you identify people who now have the immunity, and those people can go sort of back to work, back to school, with less fear of contracting the virus again or for the first time?
True and false. We can use their blood to treat other people, and that's actually, I know 4 patients that have already been treated that way, and there's an active research trial going on. That's one of the things they're studying at Emory, and another one of the things that they're studying in New York as we speak. That will give us an immediate tool to use. Now, the question is, just because you have the antibodies doesn't mean that you are absolutely immune. That's what time and more studies are going to have to show.
Yeah.
It's likely that you are, but we'll need to know that.
Okay.
So we talked about vaccines.
Getting back to school. Is it going to happen?
Back to school.
We're going back to school?
I think, again, I hate to predict. When somebody says, how long am I going to live, Doc, and I'm off by one day either way, I'm still wrong. Mm-hmm. I would be surprised if we're still dealing with this in the fall. I will be surprised. And, as you have learned, I don't get surprised that often.
No, you don't.
I think we're going to see this in through April, May, unless the cyclicity, the weather patterns that knock out influenza have some impact. I would be very surprised if this isn't something that we're through with by the summertime. And again, I think different regions of the country are going to have different time frames. New York's going into it fastest. They'll probably be coming out of it fastest. Other parts of the country may then be experiencing those surges into the early summer. But I'll be surprised if we're not back to normal in the fall. We'll have to have another one in August, and you can tell me I was wrong.
I hope I don't. So a follow-up question on that is, and I'm going to add to it from one of our young alums, are there going to be lasting impact or change on the healthcare industry due to the pandemic? Has the pandemic exposed or revealed insufficiencies in our preparation for such an event? And I would just substitute healthcare for schools. Is there going to be a lasting impact or change on schools? Both questions. Both questions.
Yeah. Obviously, my rule is I like to learn from every experience that I have. So, and again, I don't think the time to do that is when you're in the heat of battle. I mentioned that a lot of some of my partners at one of my businesses is a lot of them are Special Forces and Army Rangers, and they've taught me a lot. And they've taught me that during the heat of battle isn't the time to evaluate the mission. You sit down a couple weeks afterwards and you go through that mission. You debrief on your way home and collect the facts. I think we're going to learn a lot of things as we do from every pandemic. One of the things that I think, first of all, in my world, it's amazing. Every day I see 50 or 60 new federal regulations that are being changed, altered, or eliminated in the area of healthcare. For example, every other day of the year, I have to have a license to practice medicine in the state of Pennsylvania if I'm going to treat a patient in Pennsylvania. Medicare and the federal government through Department of Health and Human Services with the emergency declaration just ruled that back so that I can apply for emergency privileges in any state if I can prove that I have a credential of being a physician. So those are the types of things that are in place and they're being activated. We won't learn from that, but we have those tools. I think what we're going to learn is to use them more quickly. As the Federal Reserve said for economic decision-making here, there's no reason to keep powder in your pocket during this event. If you're going to do anything, do it early and do it fast. And that same thing applies to decision-making. Shut down schools quickly. There's no debate. Shut down travel quickly. There's no debate. You can always turn it back on, but you can't put the genie back in the bottle if you missed your opportunity. One of the other fascinating things that I'm seeing is, you know, there have been a lot of growth in telemedicine, the idea that you can talk to your doctor like you and I are talking tonight. There are many regulations at the state and the federal level that prevented me from doing that, and then this pandemic is rolling all of those rules back. So we're enabling telehealth through this process. So there are going to be a lot of things that we've learned from this. Every team that's made decisions should be planning a debrief when it's over. Take some time to celebrate, and then ask yourself, what did we do? What would we have done differently this time? How did our policies inform those decisions? What do we want to write down? Because you may not remember 10 years later if you're dealing with it again.
So one of our listeners, it wasn't a question, but she wrote, "Hello from Idaho. We just had an earthquake as we watched you." Well, so this is actually one of my concerns, is that here we are dealing with the COVID-19 situation. What are the chances that something is going to happen sort of on top of this? And not just in a localized way like an earthquake, but another strain, a mutation, or something totally different. And we're already at max capacity, surge capacity. Is that likely? Is that unlikely? Where have you seen that before?
If we're doing the social distancing in response to this, the likelihood of another agent, another virus, another bacteria being able to take hold and spread and move is unlikely. So I don't see one biological event on top of another. What we do see is, we're already kind of all stressed out, and yes, I'm afraid. I mean, when I think about my personal vulnerabilities here on the farm, I don't need a power outage right now. And so one of the other things I remind my teams and my family is, when you're dealing with a bad situation, I mean, we've been on the farm snowed in where we couldn't leave for 3 days with no power, heating with wood burning stoves, and we've had some of those experiences, as we all have. You don't want to make a bad situation a worse situation. Don't do anything. Now's not the time that I want to cut myself and have to go to the emergency room. So I'm also being a little bit careful. No, we have not had the chainsaw out in a couple weeks, because now's not the time that I need to have an injury or a heart attack, for that matter, and go into the hospital.
Tom,
we are looking at patients to separate out who's presenting with COVID and who are the normal patients who are still coming. But now's not the time to have an event on top of an event, but I don't think there's anything that makes it more likely.
Tom, can we, I want to go to a speed round in a few minutes here. But one sort of combined question here. It's about symptoms, and it's about how the disease itself works. So talk to us a little bit about what, I think every time we have a scratchy throat right now, or we cough or clear our throat, we're all nervous. What are the main symptoms to look for? When should we be calling our doctor, or going for testing, or going to the ER? And then, we're hearing a lot about ventilators. I said to someone, it's a dumb question, but exactly how do ventilators work? And they're talking about splitting ventilators between two patients now. And why are they so hard to make? Why don't we have enough of them?
All right. So speed round, so I'll be quick.
I'm going to clear my throat. I'm okay.
The symptoms of coronavirus, and this is one of the other reasons that it made it hard to react early on, is the symptoms look just like all of the winter colds that we have and the influenza virus that was naturally circulating in December, January, and currently. The symptoms are a fever, a cough, upper respiratory symptoms progressing to worsening pneumonia. There are some people who are going to get coronavirus and they're just going to have a little bit of a common cold and nothing at all. There are some people that are going to develop an upper respiratory infection with bronchitis, and they're going to recover, and that's going to be the end of it. Some patients are at risk from getting more severe disease. Those tend to be those with other conditions that make them more susceptible. We've talked about age, immunosuppression, people who are on steroids, people who have had chemotherapy, people who have chronic heart disease, lung disease. They're just more susceptible when they get that infection in the lung, and that's what we're talking about. The virus is setting up in the lung, does damage in the lung. Those are the patients that are going to have the higher symptoms and the higher likelihood of progressing to something more serious. That's how the virus works. It infects us, it gets into our upper respiratory system, nose, mouth, throat, and then it moves down into the lungs. It causes primarily pneumonia as the primary infection. That pneumonia can be bad enough to proceed to the point that it impacts the lungs. Our primary role of our lungs is to move air in and out of our body and to provide us with oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. When we damage the lungs, we lose the ability to move air in and out, and we lose the ability to mobilize oxygen from the air and get it into our bloodstream and to get rid of CO2. If patients are showing that they're having problems oxygenating or they're developing high levels of carbon dioxide, which we measure with the fingertip machines or with an arterial blood gas, then they may need mechanical respiratory support. That's a ventilator. The ventilator essentially is breathing for your lungs. It's blowing oxygen and air into your lungs, and it's allowing you to exhale it back out, taking the pressure off of your body from being able to do that. We can blow oxygen into that ventilator circuit, so the ventilator is providing a mechanical pump, an air pump. They're not hard to build. We have thousands of extra. We have them extra at every hospital. We have extra in our operating rooms. We have extra in the national pharmaceutical stockpile. We have a whole lot of ventilators in this country. The problem is we've got a lot of cities that all need them at the same time right now. And again, I'm not trying to downplay anything here, the seriousness of the event. But I think a lot of the stuff we're hearing on the news is exaggerated and a little bit of hyperbole, trying to sell papers and news viewers as opposed to presenting facts. As of Saturday morning, there were still excess ICU beds in New York City, and New York City is the hardest hit city that we have right now. So they are, I'm not saying it's easy to be a doctor in New York right now or that the hospitals aren't busy, but we have not reached that point where we don't have enough ventilators. We just pulled a ship that has 1,000 ICU beds into the harbor. We have other hospitals nearby. One of the things we were preparing to do on 9/11 was change Amtrak trains to hospital trains and move people from high-risk city or high-hit cities like New York and move them out of New York after 9/11 so that other hospitals could participate. We're going to be moving ventilators around the country to meet the demands of the patients. If we do our job and prevent the spread, we won't need as many ventilators. That will buy us time until we can build more. But there's just a limit to how many things you can keep in your garage waiting for the emergency.
Yeah. All right, Tom. I have one last question, and then we're going speed round. But in honor of Tom Ruth, tonight we have Tom Ruth's sister is listening in, Gretchen Batra, who's down in Asheville, North Carolina. And she wanted to thank you for your remarks about our country and the virus. She said that Tom Ruth that is, and I both had affiliations with India. And I'm sure he'd want to know too, if he were here, what do you foresee for India with respect to the coronavirus?
So coronavirus is pretty effectively moving around the world. And we've seen the impact in Europe, and again, I'll speak first of Italy. In Italy, we've seen a mortality rate for this virus that is actually closer to 4 to 5%. Whereas in the United States, the current mortality of the virus is about 1 1.6, 1.7%. From the historical cases in China, we were expecting somewhere between 2 to 3. So you have to ask, why is the mortality rate higher in Italy? And there are two things that will impact that number. One is, how much screening are we doing? And again, I know this sounds harsh, but it's a lot easier to count dead bodies and test them than it is to see how many people in the community might have been exposed to the virus. The mortality numbers are always more accurate than the screening numbers. In India right now, and again, for more information, the best site to go to is the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization site updates the situation report every single day with all reported cases from every country in the world. India is not reporting many cases right now. That could mean that it hasn't impacted India yet, which is unlikely, or it means that they're just not testing and recognizing, and that's probably the situation. I said there were two things that I didn't like about the mortality rate in Italy. One was that I think it's overestimated because the denominator is too small because they're not testing. The other issue is, if you look at the Italian population compared to the United States, in 2030, 10 years from now, all of our baby boomers will be 65 and older and collecting on Medicare and hitting my business, my primary business. That's 20% of our population will be over the age of 65, and we've said that those are high-risk patients. In Italy, at that same time period, in 10 years, 40% of the population will be over the age of 65. So when we think about our older population in the United States, who is going to be impacted more greatly by this virus unless we protect them, Italy has twice as many of those high-risk patients. The mortality rate in Italy could be elevated because of that. I think it's a mixture of those two measures. When I look at Italy right now, I don't see screening. I don't see isolation. You don't see India. I'm sorry. India does not have the public health networks that we have. India does not have the, especially remotely outside of the cities, does not have the hospital abilities to react. So if it reaches India also has a very high population density, something else that I've been watching for this. I think that the impacts in India are going to be very, very high spread rates and sadly very, very high mortality rates. You have a large population, a weak infrastructure, but I'm not seeing any of those numbers now. So if we can stop it before it reaches India, that's the best hope.
Okay. You ready for speed round?
Sure.
All right. So, and we still haven't gotten any hands raised. Usually our Hill crowd is pretty brave. So if you want your question answered, raise your hand because that's fun. All right, you ready? I've had this question come up twice. Do we need to be sterilizing our groceries and clothes when we bring them into the house? And I'll add shoes to that. You have 25 seconds to answer, Dr. McCarter.
Sterilizing clothes, shoes. When I come in,
and groceries.
My wife and my children are a bit more paranoid about this than I am even. When we come back from the grocery store, we put the groceries outside. We wipe down the outside containers of the groceries with Clorox wipes or whatever we have available before we bring them in the house. I had to stop my bananas from being wiped down the other day. I didn't want Clorox on my bananas. So it's not a bad decision to wipe down some of those surfaces of things you can.
Truthfully, you're just doing it to keep your kids out of your hair, right?
Clothes and shoes. I mean, no, I don't necessarily change my clothes when I walk inside. If it makes you feel better, go for it. It's not going to hurt. It's certainly not going to hurt.
Well, since we're all, chest up here anyway, we don't have to wear pants these days, right?
Yes.
I am wearing pants for the mat.
I am too.
Yeah. Good. All right, next speed round question. This is a big one at Hill because there's a lot of these here. Can pets contract or transmit the virus?
It's a great question. Coronaviruses are transmitted and spread within mammals. So this isn't something that is like an avian flu that's going to go from a bird to a human or a swine flu that's going to go to a pig to a human. This virus seems to travel within mammals. It is, again, rumored to possibly have started in a population of bats, possibly carried by something that looks like an anteater to a human population. So it is possible that mammals, like our dogs and cats, could contract the virus. That being said, viruses don't move from one species to another very effectively. It's odd for a virus that lives in an animal population to move to a human population, which is why these are rare events and usually result in something that's similar to this, because we don't have any immunity to it, because humans have never seen this virus before. So it is possible, but it's not, just because humans have it, it doesn't mean dogs are equally likely to have it. It's hard for a virus to move from one species to another, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, there's been very few. I mean, the WHO came out and said that dogs could not contract it. I'm not sure that that's a fair statement based on what you just said. I guess the bigger question is, if I pet my dog and I have COVID-19, and I pet my dog or he licks my hand and then goes and licks someone else's hand, is that a pretty good chance that that's going to get transmitted?
Probably not. Again, the dog is not carrying a large number of the virus. The dog's immune system, the dog's saliva is fairly good at breaking things down. Yes, I agree with the World Health Organization that it is unlikely that the virus can't move from a human to a dog like we transmit it human to human. This virus likes humans now. Okay, it had to change to move from a bat or a anteater to a human. It would have to change again to move from a human to a dog. So I don't worry about our pets.
Good, because they're our saving grace right now for many of us. Here we go. Next question. Will the virus remain in the general environment indefinitely?
It may. This may be, and I think Anthony Fauci has talked about this as well. This may be one of those viruses that are with us for a while, like flu. We may see that we need to be monitoring this and vaccinating for this as we do for other viral diseases. I mean, you mentioned measles before. I think you mentioned measles. Measles. We talked about the R0, the transmissibility. Measles R0 is 18. For one person with measles, they spread it to 18 people. That's much higher than even what we're dealing with this condition. Measles also has a 10% mortality rate. We need to get vaccinated for those conditions. If we get a vaccine for this virus, we probably all want to get it, because it will at least cycle back at some point in the next couple of years, even if it doesn't become a recurrent cycle each year.
Okay. A current parent and an alumnus, just like you, asks, reports are that cases will peak in about 14 days, but that we may remain at home until mid-May or later. Please address the long period of isolation or staying home during the waning period of the virus.
And I'm sorry, Zach, you broke up. Peak in how many days?
They said about 2 weeks, 14 days.
14 days? Yeah, I think that I don't buy those numbers. I think New York City may be reaching a peak in 14 days, but I think that at that time, we'll be seeing Washington State, Los Angeles, and New Orleans just starting where New York was last Saturday.
Maybe even locally. So if it peaks in New York in 14 days, are people in New York going to have to stay put until May, or will they be sort of released again?
Well, once the virus stops,
my parents want to know.
Yeah, once the virus stops spreading. Again, you don't want to go back to business as usual too soon. But once the virus, and again in New York, it could be. I mean, one of the other things we see with viruses is once a high percentage of the population gets it and becomes immune to it, it doesn't have anyone to spread to. It starts hitting these barriers, people who can't carry it. If the population of New York City is already at 28% carriers, it's possible that New York City will be shutting down the transmission of it very soon. Not the way we want to, but they may hit that. And then, yes, once you see, so what you're going to see is we're in an acceleration phase right now, and then you'll see a deceleration phase. You'll see people who stop testing positive, the numbers start to drop off, and that deceleration phase, you want the virus, you don't want to create a second wave. So you want to know how many people, and that's when your question of do we monitor antibodies to see if people are resistant. We want to make sure that enough people are resistant to the virus at that point in time and it's gone before we go out and reintroduce it and start spreading it. And that's why I think people are probably talking about, a mid-May window. Again, I'm hopeful. Influenza breaks up on my birthday. I want to talk to you on April 21st, and I'll let you know what I see then. It's possible that we could start seeing some numbers dropping, and it won't be the whole country. Some parts of the country are going to open up again earlier than others, just like some parts of the country closed down earlier than others.
Tom, you've dropped your birthday several times during this call. You have several family members listening in, so is there something you want them to get you on that particular day, or?
No, I'm just amazed. I mean, you kind of asked me how I got into pandemics.
I'm kidding.
Pandemics kind of float around. The only other thing that's ever happened on my birthday, it was the day that Haile Selassie, I came to Jamaica to visit the Rastafarian groups and meet Bob Marley. So I can't really talk about that as much as pandemics. So.
Well, we're just about out of time. I think we've gotten to most of the questions. There's definitely a few that we'll try to get, and maybe I'll forward them to you, Tom, and you can respond.
Sure.
I want to sort of bring everything back to Tom Ruth and to the Hill. I'm imagining that 95% of the people listening are either students, parents, or alumni tonight. How do you think the Hill has prepared our students, current students and alumni, to deal with something like this? And not just in actual training, people who go on to be physicians like yourself or epidemiologists or something like that, but how have we prepared our graduates to deal and to cope with these kinds of changes in the world?
Well, I mean, I can speak to my experience. I mean, obviously, the Hill opened up tremendous opportunities for me to be able to have a great education that gave me the core knowledge that I needed for college, for graduate school, for medicine, for business. But as I look back as an old man, that's not what I see today as the most important thing that the Hill gave me. I mean, I think the Hill taught me discipline, which again I use daily, not only in my business, but just getting through each day. The Hill showed me what excellence looked like, and that it was achievable. The Hill taught me to lead without being afraid of failure, and with humility, to make sure I surrounded myself with the best people. I listened to them and I learned from them. But most importantly, and dealing with a pandemic, as you can see, there's a lot involved in this that we don't know, we can't be predicted. And I think the Hill forced me to engage in areas outside of my comfort zone, things that weren't necessarily easy or something I was good at, and made me develop skills to approach problems that were really unknowns. And that's what we have to do when we see a situation like this, or any problem that we've not dealt with before. I mean, one of my first administrative jobs was taking 8 hospitals and 2 medical schools out of bankruptcy. It was the largest bankruptcy in the history of American medicine. I don't think I caused it. I was hired to fix it. There was no one who had ever gone through that I could follow a playbook from. Being at Hill and being in environments, doing things that I wasn't necessarily comfortable with, made me comfortable dealing with those challenges in my business and in my life afterwards. And I think, looking back, it's the most important thing I learned.
Well, Tom, thank you on behalf of our listeners, and most of them hung in there for 90 minutes, so that's amazing to me. You've been an outstanding first panelist here for this series as we go through the webcast this spring. I hope our listeners will tune in next time. We have Katie Werlow, a physician who's invented an air, it's called Life Air, and it's an air purification system for hospitals. That'll be a pretty interesting conversation. Her husband's also an ER doctor. He may be joining us as well from the front lines in the Lehigh Valley as we start to deal with this here in Pennsylvania. And we've got some amazing other speakers lined up. We've got Major General Doug Odell, who led the Katrina cleanup, hurricane cleanup in Louisiana and in the Gulf Coast. We've got Bernie Chan, one of our alums, who's a high-ranking official in Hong Kong, and will share with us how they've dealt with, successfully dealt with the COVID-19. We've got a number of other speakers that'll be joining us as we move through this and as we evolve our thinking and our knowledge. So it's a wonderful opportunity to connect with our alumni and parents. And Tom, just again, my sincere thanks. This was really a special time for us, and thank you for all your guidance here as well. I'm going to share my screen one more time here. Let's see if I can pull this off, and bingo. There we go. You know, the world will go on here. And for the alumni that are joining us tonight, we have some pretty exciting events coming up in the next, this fall. We'll have the 100th anniversary celebration. That's the 100th anniversary of the Meggs family transferring the school to the alumni and to the Board of Trustees. That'll take place on September 25th and 26th. We have the dedication of the Shirley Quadrivium Center. That'll take place on October 19th. We have paused construction, but we're hoping to get right back to it fairly soon. And then November 6th and 7th is Lawrenceville weekend. I know I've floated the idea that the class of 2020, if we do have to push off graduation, may have graduation on that weekend as well. The Dell will be cold, but I know you'll jump in anyway. We're not giving up hope on May or sometime thereafter. So thanks again for joining us. Tom, it's been wonderful having you here tonight, and let's stick together. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Zach.
Have a good night, everybody.